Okay, so in chapter 3, the first topic is on containers. And a container is much like what we've talked about before, this whole idea of having a parent and a child. So if you have a child that opens and closes inside of another tag or another element, that other element is considered its container. So a lot like if you look at this example here, the body open and the body close with all the elements inside is considered a container. The form works in the exact same way. So I'll come back to containers. It's a little bit easier than the whole form section. Scroll down here, but impossible to get it just right. Okay, so a form has a form tag, which is a form open, form closed. That is considered a container. All of the elements that appear on your form are going to be inside. Forms have two methods. One of them is the action, the other is the method. I'm sorry, two attributes. The action is the URL. Where is the data going? Now remember, you're typically sending data to a server to be stored in a database. I can't replicate that scenario here on campus, but the idea is you have a URL that defines where is the data being sent. That's really important. The method is how the data should be sent to the server. So there are two options to this. It's a get or a post. And the idea behind the get is the default. So if you don't specify, it will just send it as a get. The post sends it in its own stream. So you have a separate way of all of the data getting, whereas the get goes over in the URL. So what you will see, you'll see like this entire long string of every field with its value going over to the server. Now how it gets there, you usually have a submit button at the bottom of a form, right? So if you've bought something online, you know, you have your little button that says next or whatever it is, and that's what sends the data. Okay, and I talked about the widgets before, but the widgets are each element on your page. And then the next important thing before I actually demonstrate this are the attributes that you have. So there are two tags for every widget. And that is an input tag that receives input from a user. User can actually, the word I'm looking for, interact with your form using the input tag. There's another tag called a label. The label is what tells the user what the input tag is. Okay, so those two things typically go together. The input tag has up to 5 attributes. The first one is called the name. This identifies the field for the server. The second one is the ID. The ID attribute we talked about before. That uniquely identifies the field on the page. Then the type. The type tells it what type of data you're storing. Then the other two we'll talk about as we go, placeholder and value. So let me demonstrate it first. So and put in your default tags, or the ones you need every time, sort of your template, if you will. Finally, the body here. Maybe you can copy this from another. But here inside the body then is where you can start designing the widgets for your form. And I mean, I like to start with the most common ones. You know, usually a first name, a last name. Those are pretty straightforward and easy. But before I do that, let me just make a note. So the form tag is a container for all widgets in the form. Okay, so begin with a form open and a form close. And now let's go ahead and add that action attribute. Now I have nowhere for it to go. So you can put in an invalid URL. That's the one that they use in the book too. So it's like HTTPS. I think I just had example.com. It's not going to work, but that's okay. Right. I have nowhere for it to go, right? So the action attribute, again, is the URL of the server or where the data is going. Okay, and then the other attribute is the method, how the data is being sent. And remember what I said, that get is the default, right? So if you just had get as the default, post is the one where it sends the data separately in its own stream. But if you use get, it sends the data as part of the URL. It just appends it to the end. Okay, so now that you've got yourself set up, think about how you would design a form. And the design of the form, you want to try to make it as user-friendly as possible. You're going to add styling. There's a lot that you can do here. The first thing I would suggest is, you know, start with something simple like a first name, last name situation. Now, you have to think about the data type of those two fields. So a first name, last name, what would your data, different types of values that you could have as a data type. Okay, now I know this is pretty tiny. There are many lists available online. Your list in your book is probably abbreviated. It's not quite this long. But look at a few of them. So if I said a first name, last name, it's actually at the bottom of this center column here, text, right? This is your default type, and it accepts text. So that would be first name, last name, address, right? All those types of things. Look at some of the other ones you have. Button, checkbox. Color is a color picker. Date, if you're entering a date field, it'll come up with a date little calendar for you. So each of these will show the user a little something different, possibly. Notice there's an email, and it expects an @ symbol. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with the type attribute. All right, so let's just try a simple one. If we come over back to the code and put in an input, okay, and for your input, you're going to want to specify the type first. I like the type first. You don't have to do it in this order. Remember, these are just attributes. But your type, let's put in text. And the next thing is the ID. I like to put IDs on each of these in a form. And the reason I do that is because remember what the ID does for you. It's an attribute that's going to uniquely identify your field. This way you can use it in JavaScript, you can use it in CSS, you can use it in data validation. You're going to have to validate sometimes that the user put in the value you were expecting. So I'm going to do F name. And the third attribute I like to include every time, because everybody's got kind of their way of doing things, I like to include the name attribute, right? That is the identifier for the server. I think of it as a variable name for the server, almost. Okay, so that's how the server is making the connection that this is the first name field. Remember what you're doing, like you're creating all of these widgets that have to get stored in a database. And database will have a unique name for each of these things. Now, you don't have to match the database name per se, but usually it's a similar type of naming convention. All right, so name, and here I'm getting real creative. I'm just going to make it the same. Okay, so now let's do the input without that second field I was telling you about of a label, right? And notice what appears on my page. This is just an input field. If I click in the field itself, it accepts input. Oh, you can't see that. There, you see that? Right, it's flashing. So cursor flashing, you can enter in a first name. Right now, the data is not going anywhere. I don't have a submit button or anything like that. But this is not very user-friendly. So to make it user-friendly, typically you would have what's called a label. A label will sit in front of this so the user knows what goes into this box. So come over here and right before the input tag, put in a label. Now, the label, different from an input, has an open and a close with some content in between. Content is what the user's going to see. So if you put here, first name colon, that's what the user's going to see before the input box. And now this is an example of a single widget on your page that is going to accept text as its data type. Okay, and you gave it an ID so that you can associate some logic with that. All right, so now go ahead, render your page. Right, and so if you enter something in here, you can tab away. All good, right? But this is the indicator for the user. So try now adding a last name field. Right, so I want to see label first. Label is what's going to appear in front of the box. And then an input second. And then an input, you should notice, I think I started to mention this earlier, but the input does not have an open and a close. It's a void tag, right? There's no content to display. That is an excellent question. And it is not a very easy question to answer. Let me finish this and then I'll talk about that. Okay, so if the label is input or is last name, my input, the type of data is going to be text again. The ID is going to be, I'll make it last name, L name, and the name.
You know what they did in Zybox? They wrapped each label and input in a P tag.
I saw that, which is nice. Try this first and then try wrapping it in the P tag. So wrapping it in the P tag, yes, they did that in the textbook. Hold on, let me just, Right, and so wrapping it in a P tag will give you some spacing above, spacing below. And the question that you asked me about the submit button versus a button tag, it is somewhere on here. I made some notes about that because that's an important distinction right there. So the button tag is a button open, button close with some content in between. And you can do a lot of styling with that. The submit button uses the input tag and the type is submit. Those are two totally different things. The submit will actually send the data to the server. All right, so that takes action. Where this becomes a problem and could become a problem is with JavaScript. So when the JavaScript comes into play, most of the time there are APIs that will do the submission for you. Because if you do it this way with the submit button, it's a little heavy on the front end. You know how you're sitting there waiting sometimes and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting, right? And so you don't want a delay for the user. So my understanding is that the JavaScript APIs could be more efficient, right, from sending data.
So just use
Button tag. The other thing I've noticed is when you put data validation into your form, the JavaScript starts flipping out with this submit button. It executes some data validation more than once, and then you're caught in this like cycle, and the user, you know, from a user experience, you know how you get an error message and then you think you fixed it and then you get it again and you're like, what is going on? So it's that kind of thing that I've seen happen when you use the submit as an input tag. But we'll come back to that, and I want you guys to test that as you work with JavaScript and as you build your forms in the next couple of weeks. You know, you should test the different scenarios to see if you're getting what you want. Okay, let me stop here. Let's save this and pick up with this one next time. And let's review for the test today.